Hello, Prof. To all speakers.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you.
We are going to start at 10 o'clock.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Distinguished speakers and honorable participants, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. May peace be upon all of us. Indonesian International Islamic University is delighted to present you the first international webinar entitled The Fact and Myth of Authoritarianism in Islam. This topic is actually related to Professor Ahmad Kuru's most recent publications entitled Islam, Authoritarianism and Underdevelopment, published in 2019 by Cambridge University Press. In his book, Professor Ahmad discusses approach in understanding the cause of authoritarianism and underdevelopment in Muslim countries. He also addresses on the relations between religious, political, intellectual, and economic classes. His hypothetical question is why policymakers in Western countries fail to offer consistent policies in promoting democracy and development in Muslim countries, whereas the overwhelming majority of Muslims are in favor of democracy and against authoritarianism and underdevelopment. All blessed speakers and participants, Triple IU is a newly established state international university founded in 2016 with presidential regulations and operates under the administration of the Ministry of Religious Affairs. In 2019, His Excellency President Joko Widodo appointed a leading Indonesian intellectual, Professor Komarudin Hidayat, to be the first rector, with the task to build academic system required before the university is operated. This webinar is a special series prepared towards the official opening of this campus in September 2021. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Imansari Ujianti. Before I invite Professor Komarudin Hidayat to deliver webinar opening remarks, I would like to draw your attention to the following brief video. Please watch.
Universitas Islam Internasional Indonesia adalah graduate school. Universitas Islam bertaraf internasional menjadi pusat pengkajian kebudayaan Islam yang modern, toleran, dan berkemajuan.
Secara fisik kampus ini didesain sebagai kampus yang ikonik, yang futuristik, dan diharapkan inilah salah satu model kampus dengan arsitektur tropikal. Kita harapkan bahwa para mahasiswa Sivitas Akademika itu nantinya menikmati suasana kampus yang hijau, yang berbuah, kemudian mereka juga bisa olahraga pagi, sore, naik sepeda dari asrama ke fakultas, ke library, ke masjid. Kampus ini kita harapkan betul-betul sebagai satu center for the epistemic community, pusat dari masyarakat ilmiah. Mereka ke sini betul-betul fokus untuk studi. Di samping Indonesia sebagai laboratorium yang hidup, pengalaman kita berdemokrasi, pengalaman bagaimana mendirikan republik ini, dan ini bukan Islamic State, kita juga menjaga kebinekaan. Hal-hal seperti ini kan unik sekali. Nah, bagaimana ini bisa kita kemas dalam satu format akademik dan budaya, kemudian menjadi semacam konsumsi intelektual bagi masyarakat intelektual Indonesia dan juga bagi masyarakat luar yang datang ke sini. Karena sebuah universitas itu mesti ada yaitu program humaniora, ilmu sosial, sains, di samping juga studi keagamaan. Dengan adanya beberapa tenaga ahli dari dalam luar negeri, mereka itu tidak saja memberi kuliah bagi mahasiswa dalam kelas, tapi kita harapkan mereka juga bisa diambil manfaatnya dan memberi manfaat pada komunitas di luar kampus ini. Dengan demikian kampus ini tidak saja dimiliki oleh masyarakat Indonesia, kita harapkan kampus ini dimiliki juga oleh dunia Islam. Keislaman yang berkembang dan yang kita kembangkan itu keislaman yang terkoneksi, terbuka, berdialog dengan ilmu-ilmu yang lain. Sekarang bagaimana kampus ini juga menyambung perkembangan sejarah yang agak terputus, satu bangunan ilmu yang sudah terpisahkan, yang sudah terdistorsi, yang termiskinkan. Kampus Islam itu tidak hanya Islamic Studies sesungguhnya, tapi juga mencakup berbagai ilmu-ilmu yang lain.
Dari Universitas Islam Internasional Indonesia akan lahir intelektual yang memahami persoalan kehidupan global, menghadirkan solusi yang efektif dan bermanfaat untuk semesta. Rahmatan lil alamin.
That's all the video that provides you with brief information about IIIU. And now, let us listen to a welcoming speech by Professor Komarudin Hidayat.
Well, thank you, Sari, moderator. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Let me start by thanking all participants, my friend, Prof. Ahmad Kuru, Prof. Nur Haidi Hasan, Burhanuddin PSD, and all participants for joining this first international webinar conducted by Indonesian International University. And we used to say IIIU. My special gratitude I express to Professor Ahmad Kuru for accepting our invitation, discussing your new book entitled Islam, Authoritarianism, and Underdevelopment, which has been translated into Bahasa Indonesia. I know your book has been widely read in Indonesia. It's quite interesting. I also start reading, but not finished yet. The book attempts to answer significant questions on how and why Muslim countries are left behind in economic, social, and political development. I want to highlight briefly the essential argument that you brilliantly put in your book. As you argued, if Muslims would like to catch up the development, they should build independent scholar to develop knowledge and science. And you also state that the importance of bourgeoisie class that helps develop a strong economy and politics. Well, I feel that your statement resonates with our vision and mission of the IIIU. Actually, I want to explain briefly about this campus university, but since I have talked about that through this video, so I don't need to explain further about what is IIIU. Therefore, one thing that I would like to emphasize here, why we choose graduate university level. The IIIU is graduate university that will offer only master and PhD level. Why graduate university? We know that graduate students work at a significantly higher intellectual level than undergraduates. This is particularly true for research, which is key focus of activity in graduate university. The proliferation in recent years of the so-called Barcelona model, whereby undergraduate studies are seen as preparation for more meaningful studies at the graduate level, justifies this idea. Many universities in the world have adopted the graduate model where professional degrees can only be taken at the graduate level. Well, I think enough because I have explained already through this video. Therefore, I would end my word here and enjoy your time and have a productive seminar. Thank you again to Prof. Ahmad. We are waiting for you visit to Indonesia. Jakarta host Geldinis, Ben back to your room. Thank you. Well, Nur Haidi Hasan, Brandum Tadi, and also Jamhari. Thank you, and also again to all participants. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, Professor, for your inspiring opening remarks. And now I would like to invite Professor Jamhari, the Vice Rector for Cooperation and Research, to chair this webinar session. Professor Jamhari, the time is yours.
Unmute, please. Halo, Jam. Okay.
Sorry. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Very good morning, very good afternoon, and even very good evening. This is the beauty of online webinar. Anyone can participate, though at a different time. My name is Jamhari. I am part of the IIU's gang here. Welcome to all participants to this international webinar series conducted by Indonesian International Islamic University, or IIU in Jakarta. IIU is a new state university that will be open in September this year. Thank you, Professor Komarudin Hidayat, Director of the IIU, who has explained the IIU's vision and mission. The topic to today's webinar is Fact and Myth of Authoritarianism in Islam, Historical Trajectory from the Past to Present. This webinar was inspired by Professor Ahmad Kuru's recent book, Islam, Authoritarianism, and Underdevelopment, a Global and Historical Comparison. We are pleased to have Professor Kuru discuss his book together with Professor Nohaidi Hassan and Burhanuddin Muhtadi, PhD. I would like to start by some integrating questions asked by many. Why have the Islamic countries failed to develop, even with the abundance of natural resources like gas and oil? Does certain alliance of state ulama have caused the problem of authoritarian and underdevelopment in the Muslim countries? What can we learn from the history of Islamic civilization that we may nurture today? Now I'm delighted to introduce and invite our main speaker, Professor Ahmad Kuru. Professor Ahmad Kuru is Bruce Fortisius Professor of Political Science at San Diego State University. He was a postdoctoral scholar at Columbia University. Professor Kuru is the author of Secularism and State Policies Toward Religion, the United States, France, and Turkey, Cambridge University Press, 2009, which received the Book Award of the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion. He is also the co-editor with Alfred Stepan of Democracy, Islam, and Secularism in Turkey, published by Columbia University Press, 2012. Professor Kuru's article appeared in various journals, including World Politics, Comparative Politics, and Political Science Quarterly. His recent book, Islam, Authoritarianism, and Underdevelopment, a Global and Historical Comparison, published by Cambridge University Press 2019, became the co-winner of the American Political Science Association's International History and Politics Section Book Award. Professor Kuru's work has been translated into Arabic, Bosnian, Chinese, French, Indonesian, and Turkish. I think Professor Kuru, you stand in our triple IU will make difference of our university. So please, Professor Kuru, time is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm grateful to Rector Hidayat and organizer Dr. Hashim, and then the discussants Dr. Muhtadi and Hassan, and the moderator Jamkari, and all others who contributed to make this event possible. And let me start with also providing my condolences to those who lost their lives during the recent earthquake in Indonesia, because interestingly now my family members and my friends know that I am connected to Indonesia. My wife asked me to send a message in Twitter for my condolences. Even a friend of mine emailed me from France saying that Ahmed, an earthquake happened in Indonesia and you have friends there, send a message. So my connection is very well known, alhamdulillah, with Indonesia, and I'm really sorry about the earthquake and share your grievances. And I'm also thankful to KPG and my editor, Andre Primandia, who is in the audience today, for this excellent translation of my book to Indonesian. And since I am sharing my anecdotes, another friend of mine called me after the translation published saying that, do you know how important it is? It may be more important than its English public edition. So because Indonesia is a big country and it's very important to discussions about Islam and democracy. It's very crucial, and I'm very helpful to see. I'm very thankful and also happy to see its translation. And inshallah, this year, Arabic, Bosnian, and Persian translations of this book also will come out. Therefore, we'll have a bigger discussion on the topic with new participants. So before the presentation, I also would like to emphasize that, as I wrote in the preface of the translation of the Indonesian edition of my book, I have received questions wherever I go, from Harvard to Oslo, about the case of Indonesia. After my presentation, always someone in the audience raise hand and ask, how would your argument related to the case of Indonesia? And I'm trying to say a few things with my limited knowledge about Indonesia, saying that it's a democratic country, it's more developed than other Muslim majority countries, and it may show that with less oil revenue, it's no longer a rentier case, and probably less ulama-state alliance, we have more chances to see democratization and development in such cases as Senegal in West Africa, Tunisia in North Africa, and we have a bigger country, Indonesia, in Southeast Asia. And in fact, today I want to learn more from Dr. Hassan and Dr. Muhtadi, what they think, how the arguments make sense or not in the Indonesian case. And in the long run, inshallah, I'm looking forward to a broader discussion with the Indonesian translation and friends in Indonesia. So let me briefly summarize the argument by showing some PowerPoints. So I forgot to say Salamun Alaikum. Let me say Assalamu Alaikum wa Rahmatullah and Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. So the research question is contemporary. I am not a historian, but the answer brings me to a historical debate. As you will see in my PowerPoint presentation, is it fine and visible now, the PowerPoint? Okay. So this is the English version of Islam, Authoritarianism, and Underdevelopment, a global and historical comparison. It's a global comparison because I try to put the 49 Muslim majority countries into a context of the globe and the worldwide comparisons, but also historical analysis. And I compare both the historical periods in the Muslim world with contemporary period, and also the Muslim world with Western Europe, from history to present. Therefore, there are multiple levels of comparisons in the analysis. And then when we look at the Indonesian translation, the subtitle emphasizes more the comparison within the Muslim world. It's important, but also there is the comparison between Muslim world and the Western Europe. That's what I want to emphasize. So maybe I should share again. Okay, that's better. So there are two major data sets that constitute the research question. One is the Freedom House data sets. When we look at the Freedom House data about the electoral democracies, the world has 60% rate. 60% of about 200 countries in the world are electoral democracies. Whereas out of 49 Muslim majority countries, we only have 14%, including Indonesia, Senegal, and Tunisia, I already mentioned. In addition to this data, we also have socioeconomic criteria. Regarding GNI per capita, gross national income per capita, despite the oil revenues, in average, Muslim majority countries have only 9,000 GNI per capita dollar, whereas the world average is $14,000. Literacy rates, 73% in the Muslim world, 84% world average. Schooling per person, 5.8 years in the Muslim world, 7.5 in the world average. Life expectancy, 66 years versus 69 years. So what explains this gap, not only between Muslim majority countries and Western countries, but also between Muslim majority countries and the world averages? And the question becomes even more puzzling when we know that Muslims had a brilliant civilization between 8th and 12th centuries, and they were economically and philosophically much more successful than Western Europeans between 8th and 12th centuries. That makes the question even more puzzling and interesting, and say, what explains after that deep historical success, Muslims have this underdeveloped and authoritarian status today? So from academia to the people on the street, there are two main arguments to address this question. One is essentialism, or you may call it Orientalism, or you may call it Islamophobia, that single out Islam as the sources of all problems. It exists not only in Western academia, but also in many Middle Eastern and other Muslim majority countries. Several secularist ideologues and party members blame Islam explicitly or implicitly as the source of the problem. And throughout my book, I take this argument seriously and show that historically Islam was perfectly compatible with development. And today, what we see as anti-development, anti-democratic attitudes, mostly they are human products, interpretations, rather than Islam itself. On the other side, almost the opposite argument, blaming Western imperialism, colonization. Again, it exists in the Western academia and the Middle Eastern political circles throughout the world, both the people on the street and the academics. Many of them argue that the Western colonization is the sources of the problem. Again, I take this seriously from the beginning of my book toward the end, but showing that when the colonization began in the 18th century, Muslims already had stagnation in various parts of the Muslim world, already lost their precious dynamism philosophically and economically. Therefore, colonization came after the problem began. There is also a third approach, which is more scientific than political and daily life discussion. Recently, several scholars like Daran Acemoğlu published books like Why Nations Fail, pointing to institutions as the source of problem. I'm friendlier with this argument, but also criticize it, saying that who built good institutions? Because the whole argument is that if you have good institutions, you have democracy and development. But where are the institutions coming from? I argue that human beings, certain class of peoples, build institutions. And in both the Muslim cases and Western European cases, there are 4 classes I've tried to focus on: political class, religious class, economic class, and intellectual class. So starting the historical analysis, I tried to show that there was an era of Muslim supremacy, that many books and articles today criticizing Muslims, they ignore how Muslims were successful between 700 and 1200, economically, scientifically. And the military is a third thing. It's not that important. I still put it in my table, but I focus on science and economy as more important factors. And then problems began in the 11th century, but a mistake some scholars and pundits did is that they assumed that after the problems began in 11th century, Western supremacy immediately began. But I said, no, there is a long period of time, about 5 centuries, from 1200 to 1700, Muslim world and Western Europe were comparable scientifically, economically. Only after the 17th century, the Western supremacy began and continues until today in terms of both science and economy. So what explains this transformation? I try to explain it by class relations in both cases, both the Muslim world and Western Europe. In the Muslim world, until mid-11th century, there were independent scholars and the merchants. And the merchants were funding scholars that makes them independent of the state, intellectually more creative, and making religion more an independent entity as a moral authority rather than serving political purposes. But then things change. In the 11th century, an alliance emerged between the ulama, the Islamic scholars, the doctors of laws, and other Islamic sciences like tafsir, the exegesis of the Quran, and the scholars of hadith. They establish an alliance with the ruling class. The ruling class can be kings, monarchs, sultan, padishah, or a military oligarchy like Mamluks in Egypt. And this alliance became very strong, that until today, with certain zigzags, ups and downs, it continued to exist. And it marginalized independent scholars and independent merchants. So what do I mean by intellectuals? I don't simply refer to, say, philosophers like Ibn Sina. Philosophers are important. Khwarizmi from Central Asia developed the mathematical, numerical tools we use today, and the terms algebra or algorithms, many of them coming from Al-Khwarizmi. Razi was an important medical doctor who differentiated certain viruses like chickenpox and smallpox. Ibn al-Haytham in Egypt developed the first camera obscurica that we use camera today in a dark room. Farabi, an important political philosopher and musician. Ibn Sina, both a medical doctor and important philosopher. And Biruni wrote the most comprehensive book on India that was not surpassed about 5-6 centuries. And all of them live between 9 and 11 centuries. But in addition to that, there were Islamic scholars like Abu Hanifa, and I consider them as intellectuals because they stood up against the political authority. They defended their independence. They had different ideas, as I discuss in my book. Abu Hanifa was more reason-based, ray-based, a more creative thinker than Ibn Hanbal, who was more literalist, a hadith scholar, and Shafi also more Ahl Hadith. But all of them had a common feature, despite the difference that Abu Hanifa was much more rationalist than Shafi and Ibn Hanbal, but they all put a distance between themselves and the political authority. And this has a historical reason, because the first Muslim empire, Umayyads, emerged by oppressing the Prophet's family. So not only Shias regard Umayyads as oppressor, but Sunnis also accepted today that they got Hussein, the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, killed, and they attacked Mecca, Medina, the Umayyads, and they were not apologetic about it. Umayyads regard themselves as kind of secular rulers, emphasizing raison d'etat, the importance of the state interests. They put morality aside. Abbasids came with almost similar secular mentality and putting politics and political rules at the top more important than morality. That makes Islamic scholars put a distance and say politicians are corrupt, we should not serve them, we should be independent. And Abu Hanifa and others had money also to preserve their independence, because as I use Cohen's data in my book and summarize here, between 8th and mid-11th century, out of 3,900 scholars, 90% or so have independent funding, especially commerce. Only 9% were state officials, like Imam Yusuf and others. They were exceptions. So let me go quickly from now on, because I don't have much time, and I will briefly summarize the argument with some slides. Things changed in the 11th century, and it was a multi-layer transformation. Economically, there was a decline of fertility in the Iraqi fields, which made the Abbasid treasury almost empty. Therefore, the caliphs started to distribute iqta, which is land revenue distribution, instead of cash. Buyuts, then Seljuks, even developed the iqta system in a deeper way, which restrict private land ownership and private economic entrepreneurship in general. In addition to that, military states emerge. Ghaznavids, then Seljuks. The Turkic nomadic forces establish military state with the idea of fetih, which is conquest. And the third thing is that the Abbasid caliphs in Baghdad, Qadir then Qaim, became marginalized as a result of the rise of Shia political forces. Fatimids in Egypt, Karmatis in Arabian Peninsula, Hamdanis in Syria, even Baghdad Buyids. And then this Qadir declared a creed saying that all Sunnis should be unified. Mu'tazila, rationalist theologians, Kalam scholars, are infidel. Certain Shia, especially Ismailis, are infidel. Non-practicing Muslims who do not 5 times a day practice, infidel. And this call eventually unified Seljuk sultans, Abbasi caliphs, and Persian bureaucrats. Therefore, Turks, Arab, Persians unify Sunni bloc, and a genius scholar that I cited over 100 times in my book, Ghazali. And Ghazali wrote 2 books, Attacking Philosophers, Tahafut al-Falasafa, and then also wrote a book, Attacking Ismaili Shias. And in several of his books, made a very important contribution to the ulama-state alliance, declare Ibn Sina and Farabi infidels. One last thing I want to say about Ghazali is that he himself was unhappy, undecided. At the age of 40, he had a crisis. He regretted. He went to the mausoleum or graveyard of Prophet Abraham and took an oath saying that I will never receive money from the state rulers again. I will not join their majlis or the gatherings to have dispute. I will not teach in a state-run madrasa, Nizamiya madrasa established by Nizam al-Mulk. So even the ideologue of this system, until today, who played the most important role, knew that what they established as ulama state alliance, there was something wrong. it was against the original idea of ulama independence. It was really wrong to have such direct connection, and it had corrupting thing to have collaboration with state authority. Even Ghazali knew that, but the system was so strong, it had established itself, and then came enemies which make the system stronger. One from East, Mongols, one from West, the Crusaders. So this ulama-state alliance with ideological, economic, political factors had the agents, as I said, caliphs, sultans, Nizam al-Mulk, Ghazali, and they established madrasa system in Central Asia, Iran, Iraq. And they marginalized scholars and merchants. By the Mongols and Crusaders, this system spread to Syria, Egypt, and other parts of the Muslim world, including North Africa. Because when the Mongols attack and then Muslims experience massacres, they sought refuge for military heroes. They ask help of the military because it's normal human attitude when you have survival threats, your life is under attack by barbarians like Mongols, you wouldn't seek for art and philosophy and science. You would ask a military hero to save you. And the military hero came in the name of Saladin. And Saladin defeated Crusaders, regained Jerusalem. He destroyed the Fatimi library and Fatimi dynasty. And he established Ayyubids. Then came the Mamluks following Ayyubids. And Mamluks was the force who defeated the Mongols, which make them also a hero. And these military heroes defending Muslim world against the Crusaders and Mongols eventually make the ulama state alliance, and the state here is a military state, much stronger and widespread. And certain ulama provide ideological framework for this alliance, and a major is Ibn Taymiyyah. And I analyze in my book how Ibn Taymiyyah, in his book, Sharia-based government, reinterpret the important phrase in the Quran, Ulul Amr Minkum, those who have authority among you. So far, many interpretations of this verse, Ulul Amr can be those who have knowledge, expertise. Some say it is the ulama only, but Ibn Taymiyyah says it's ulama and umara. Umara, basically state rulers. That's what I call ulama state alliance. Now have basis in the Quran. Became very difficult to challenge because the people think that it's a Quranic order, although the verse does not refer to either ulama or the state. It's an interpretation. But let me emphasize that despite all these processes, Muslims still produce cutting-edge philosophers like Ibn Rushd, Ibn Khaldun, but these were mostly neglected. Ibn Khaldun was forgotten. Ibn Rushd was persecuted. Several of his writings, like his exegesis of Plato's Republic, today we have it from the Hebrew translation because the Arabic original was burned and destroyed. So there were still some merchants like Kerimis, but eventually they were marginalized by ulama state alliance. I have some data to explain the difference between the golden age and the later periods, how the ulama state alliance had more professions, more resources, therefore more occupational terms, whereas the commercial terms remain stagnant in the Muslim world. And then came three empires, and this is very important because in this discussion, some people say that it was the Mongols and Crusaders who destroyed the Muslim empire. But after the Mongols and Crusaders, Muslims recover politically, militarily, even to a certain extent economically. They establish big empires, but they never recover philosophically and scientifically because all three empires, Ottoman, Safavi, Mughals, were based on the military notion. Especially in Ottoman and Safavi, Ottomans had the Sunni ulama state alliance. Safavi have Shia ulama state alliance. and they marginalized philosophers and economic entrepreneurs. Whereas at that time, Europe transformed. Between 8th and 12th centuries, Europe was dominated by clergy-state alliance. But after the 11th century, Europe experienced the rise of intellectuals, the rise of bourgeoisie, with universities and city-states. And they use three important tools. Chinese invented them, Europeans developed and used them: gunpowder, nautical compass, and printing press. And out of the three, the Muslim empires only effectively used gunpowder because the policymakers were ulama and the military commanders. Then the military understood the importance of gunpowder. And the ulama could not say that, oh, it is haram, it is forbidden, it's from the West, because the military commander would not let them to intervene in such a military affair. The gunpowder was used effectively. But this two-class ulama and state didn't understand the importance of nautical compass, and the ulama regarding printing press as a problem, as a threat to their educational and religious monopoly. That's why for about 3 centuries, Muslims did not embrace the printing technology. It was a major problem. I have the data in my book that in the 18th century, the Ottomans, despite the fact that they were ahead of other Muslim, at least Middle Eastern cases in terms of embracing printing press, they only published 50,000 books in the 18th century. But in the same century, Western Europeans published 1 billion books. And 1 billion books also related to literacy rate. In the early 1800s, the estimate literacy rate in the Ottoman Empire only 1%, whereas 31% in Western Europe. And this is the historical origin of the problems I try to summarize at the beginning of my presentation. Literacy rate is important of one of those problems. So then came the colonization, as you see in this map, and with the color of England, you see subcontinent, Netherlands, you see Indonesia, and then France, West Africa. Even after the First World War, many Ottoman lands were colonized. Of course, certain Muslim reformists realized the problem as early as the early 19th century. The Ottomans, without colonization, themselves decide to modernize. In 1839, the Ottomans reformers declared Tanzimat, that they would have a European-style school system, European-style military system. But these modernist attempts mostly failed. Not totally, but to a certain extent, because they were mostly ran by military leaders like Atatürk of Turkey and Jamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt. And these military leaders did not appreciate sufficiently the intellectuals and the bourgeoisie. They were mostly statists. And then more recently, especially after the Iranian Revolution, in many cases, we see the re-emergence of ulama-state alliance. Even in the secular Turkey and formerly secular Egypt, we see now the Diyanet in Turkey, Al-Azhar in Egypt, certain in Pakistan, ulama-state alliance. And the marginalization of intellectuals and the bourgeoisie continued. And as we see in this table, most Muslim majority countries are oil rentier, 40% or so of their revenue coming from oil. So neither the ulama nor the state bureaucrats are a productive class. They need a rent and external funding. And historically, it was ICTA, land revenue. Today, it's oil revenue. And out of 28 rentier states in the world, as you see in this table, 21 or 2 of them are Muslim, although Muslims constitute only 25% of all the countries in the world. They constitute 75% of rentier states in the world. That's how the ulama state alliance fund itself in many cases like Iran, Saudi Arabia, and others. So to conclude, I want to emphasize again that Islam is not the culprit. And Islam, in fact, Ulama State Alliance is a construction, historical construction. It's not an essence of Islam. There is no essential difference between Islam and Christianity on that issue. And colonization is not the expansion either, because it started after the stagnation already emerged. Yes, institutions matter, but they are built by human beings, and we have to know who the human beings are. In many cases, the ulama, the state, and their alliance have both the power and ideology to build and protect their extractive institutions. So this is the problem in Dunya Muslim, as you say, and that's, I hope to see that in the Muslim world, with an emphasis on the bourgeoisie, economic entrepreneurs, and intellectuals, these problems can be addressed. And Muslims do not need to imitate the Western model completely, because they have enough inspiration in their own early history. So thank you for listening. And if there are questions, I'll be happy to answer. And I'm looking forward to the discussions, comments, and criticisms of Dr. Hassan and Dr. Burhanuddin. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kuru, for your enlightening presentation. And I think the presentation is very concise and also describe the essential argumentation of your book. And we learned that across the historical of Islamic civilization, there are a number of changing in the ulama and state alliance. I think that's that we can discuss later on the position of the independent scholars or independent ulama in the historical of Islam civilization. Thank you once again, Professor Kuru.
Thank you.
For all participants who would like to ask your question, you may write on Q&A features on below on your Zoom screen. And then we can select some of your questions to be answered by panelists later on. Now, I would like to invite Professor Nur Hadi Hassan to give comment and also make context of Professor Kuru's book into Indonesian political and social context. Professor Nur Hadi Hassan, member of Indonesian Academy of Science, is the Dean of Postgraduate School of Sunan Kalijaga State Islamic University, Jakarta. Professor Nur Hadi Hassan obtained PhD from Utrecht University. He has expanded his academic experience by becoming a postdoctoral fellow in many international universities, including the National University of Singapore, KITLF Leiden, Nanyang Technology University of Singapore, Clingendael, Den Haag, EHES, France, and Institute of Social Anthropology, Austrian Academy of Science, Vienna, and many more. He is a prolific writer. Nur Hadi is the author of Public Islam in Indonesia, Piety, Politics, and Identity, Amsterdam University Press 2018. His articles appear in many Scopus Index journals, including the Al-Jamiah Journal of Islamic Studies, Journal of Islam and Muslim Societies, and many more. His most recent publication is Wali and Karoma, a discourse and authority contestation in Al-Tirmizi al-Bugot al-Adhkiyah, published in Jamiah 2019. So please, Professor Nur Hadi Hassan, time is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Jamhari Ma'ruf, for your generous introduction. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Kamarudin Hidayat, Director of IIIU, the moderator, Professor Jamhari, and also the organizer of this webinar, Dr. Shafiq Hasim, for inviting me to join this prestigious webinar organized by IIIU. Secondly, I would like to congratulate Professor Ahmad Kuru for this great book. I enjoy very much reading your book and also listening to your presentation. I think your book has contributed a lot to the existing literature on Islam and democracy, and also to enrich our insights into understanding the problems afflicting Muslim society. I have a PPT presentation that I would like to share with all the participants and also the speakers of this webinar. Here it is. Yes. Yes, I believe that this great book was born out of great concerns the author has with the problems facing the Muslim countries. We understand that Muslim countries, I mean Muslim majority countries, in comparison to what average, are still underdeveloped. Yeah, this is indicated, for instance, by the GDP or GDI as well, literary rate, as you explained in your presentations, years of schooling and life expectancy, and so on and so forth. And all these indicators actually form HDI ranking, yeah, Human Development Index ranking. And this is widely discussed among scholars in Indonesia as well, when we try to understand the position of the Muslim world vis-a-vis other countries in the world. In this HDI ranking, actually the position of Muslim countries are generally in the middle of our ranking. Only like 5 or 6 countries are in the 50 base HDI rankings, like United Arab Emirates 35, Saudi Arabia 36, Brunei Darussalam 43, Bahrain 45, and Oman 47. There is are in the middle or in the lower position, like Turkey 59, Malaysia 62, Iran 65, Libya 110, and surprisingly Indonesia is position is ranked only in 111, one level under Libya, which had only experience war and different kind of difficulties. I would like to highlight that this HDI ranking is not always parallel with the democracy index. Actually, I think there is an assumption widely accepted by scholars. There is a parallelism between HDI ranking or the index of development with the democracy index. The higher the HDI ranking of a country, the higher the position of the country in the democracy index. But it is not always the case, although we still accept that patterns. The position of majority Muslim countries are indeed in the category of authoritarian and hybrid regimes, or at base, flow democracy. Look at, for instance, Indonesia. In the HDI ranking, this is 111. But here, in the democracy index, Indonesia belongs to the category of flow democracy, with the scores between 6 and 7. It is much better than Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is number 36, yes, in the HDI ranking. But in the democracy index, it belongs to the authoritarian regime, the lowest level. The score is between 0 to 0. So looking into this data, actually, there is still some reservation to accept the thesis that there is a direct relation between the development and the quality of democracy in the country. I just want to highlight some important theses by Professor Kuru in his book, despite the fact that he already explains in a length in his presentation, but at least we need to know more about this. Professor Kuru argues that the situation afflicting Muslim countries is not caused by something intrinsic to Islam as a religion that has a set of particular norms and teaching, nor by Western colonialism. The so-called essentialist model that always try to understand that all problems afflicting Muslim countries are rooted in the religion, Islam as a religion. And they normally refer to some, let's say, ayat or hadith to support their arguments. According to Professor Kuru, the situation is rather caused by the ulama-state alliance that has monopolized discourse and left no space for critical thinking and individual freedom. Because the absence of the independence of the ulama and the scholars, there was no critical thinking, and this contribute a lot to the underdevelopment of Muslim countries. And this alliance, he argues, further is embedded in long historical trajectory of Muslims, starting in the 11th century Seljuk regime and continue for centuries. Of course, we can still question this kind of argument, whether the situation before the Seljuk regime was quite ideal, yes? As he already indicated that actually the Muawiyah, for instance, was not the ideal ruler. He was responsible for bringing back the absolute monarchs into Islamic history. We understand that during the Khulafaur Rashidin, ruler was elected by the community or by the Surah Council. That there was a sense of democracy during the Khulafaur Rashidin era. But after the Khulafaur Rashidin, Muawiyah came to power and he removed all this kind of democratic mechanisms and introduced the absolute monarchs. If we accept the Muawiyah period as one of the, as belonging to the models for history of the Muslim world, we
sehingga apa yang tadi disampaikan oleh Profesor Komarudin Hidayat, kemudian Profesor Ali Ramdhani segera bisa diwujudkan.
Sorry. Also the idea is if we accept this thesis, actually we accept the idea that absolute monarch is okay as long as they do not interfere in ulama enterprise. But this is, I guess, not the case. Absolute monarch in general cannot accept the independence of the ulama or the intellectual to work for freedom of thinking and so on and so forth. So this is still rather complicated to accept in my opinions. And also, but anyway, Professor Kuru's thesis has contributed a great deal to the debates that have long taken place among scholars and observers concerning the relationship between Islam and democracy, or by extensions, modernity. This thesis, to my opinion, belongs to the critical madhab in the debates that refuse Muslim exceptionalism theories, or what Professor Kuru say as essentialist model. Scholars like Bernard Lewis or other scholars, including Muslim scholars themselves, many of them argue that Muslims are simply not ready for free and fair election. They are not ready for democracy, and that the best they could hope for would be the Sharia-inspired practice of Shura. This is because they are Muslims whose religious doctrine is totalitarian in nature. They refer to the ayat in the Quran like Atiullah wa atiur Rasulullah ulil amri minkum, for instance. As the basis for their arguments. But I do believe actually this work by Professor Kuru is somehow inspired as well by recent book by Asif Bayat, for instance. Like 1 decade ago, Asif Bayat published his important book, Making Islam Democratic. In this book, Asif Bayat argued that this kind of exceptional explanations come from a wrong questions. The wrong question is whether Islam is or is not compatible with democracy. This is still, widely spoken questions by scholars and observers when they try to understand the Muslim world. Because if you raise this kind of question, the answer would be only two: yes or not. If Islam is compatible with democracy, you will be kind of apologetic scholars. You try to support your argument by saying, for instance, there is a shura in Islam, وَأَمُوهُمْ شُورَى بَيْنَهُمْ in the Quran, and also La Ikraha fid-din, for instance, as a foundation for religious freedom. If you say no, and then you become like, the scholars that try to attack Islam because you don't believe that Islam has some democratic foundation. To Asibaya, nothing intrinsic to Islam actually, or for that matter, no any other religion, make it inherently democratic or undemocratic. Religion is a matter of interpretation. Social actors play quite important role in this regard. They can give an interpretation that support Islam to be a democratic force, to be the democratic foundation for a nation. Scholars also can give an interpretation that prevents Muslims to accept democracy. This is all, again, depending on the interest of the scholars working under particular context. So Asif Bayat highlighted that Islam has the potential to go in hand with democracy or otherwise, depending on surrounding political, economic, social, and cultural circumstance. So if you try to understand what happened in the Muslim world in relation to violence, authoritarianism, and democracy, you should understand the real context that happened in the Muslim world, the political, economic situation, and so on and so forth. Kuru believes actually that those singling out Islam as the cause of violence disregard the fact that violence is a general human problem. The same also holds true for other problems, such as poverty and gender inequality. But actually, Muslim scholars, including in Indonesia, many of them still believe when they analyze the problems afflicting Muslim countries, like the problem of poverty or gender inequality, for instance, they always think about Islam. They already connect this problem with Islam as if Islam is the only troublemaker behind such a problem. This has not happened when they discuss other part of the world. For instance, Latin America. There is also poverty in Latin America. In Africa as well, there is also violence, there is gender inequality. But when you discuss about those countries, you neglect that, or you reject the thesis that religion probably contribute to such a problem. Professor Kuru moved away from this Muslim exceptionalism theory to look at the condition under which Muslims can make Islam and democracy compatible. But this attempt leads him to evaluate the historical trajectory of Muslims by idealizing the first 4 centuries of Islam as a model. That I a little bit doubt about that, because as I said before, Muawiyah was not an ideal ruler. He was responsible for the what is that, absolute monarch, and so on and so forth. And also he tried to downplay the centuries up. He neglects the dynamics, the centuries after. I believe actually after the 11th century, there was still a dynamics among Muslim scholars. They could produce treatises, they could produce books, and they could also produce nuanced ideas how to make Islam prosper. Like the Maqasidul Sharia idea by Ash-Shatibi, for instance. It was born in the 15th century, and I think, actually provided the foundation for Muslims to accept Enlightenment idea. And Professor Kuru also rejects the anti-colonial approach, blaming the Western colonization as the main cause of Muslim countries because of the historical reason and so on and so forth. And this approach is believed to have overemphasized the impact of Muslim countries' policies toward other part of the Muslim world. But I still, ask myself about if we accept that the past is responsible to what happened today in Muslim countries, which past is actually the most responsible? Whether the long, long past, the 11th century, of Islam, or the 12th century of Islam, the 13th century or the 14th century of Muslim society, or the recent past. I understand indeed that past history has had an overwhelming and decisive influence in shaping Muslim present-day receptivity to democracy. But I agree with Abdul Filali Ansari in his 1999 articles published in Journal of Democracy, who argue that the past that is most relevant today is not the early centuries of Islamic history, but rather the 19th century encounter of Muslims with the West. Muslims are not exceptionalists, whose character has been determined by a specific teaching and a specific and remote period in their past. Because if we believe that Muslims are not exceptionalists, and then also we cannot blame certain part of history of the Muslim as responsible to what happened in their life today. So Muslims' problematic encounter with the West is not so much about the colonization itself, but rather their misunderstanding of the West positivism and secularism that is believed as Ladini. Positivism or secularism was translated as Ladini, non-religious, irreligious, and also some other scholars translated positivism and secularism into Arabic ilmani, this worldly. So they distinguish the world into Ladini and Dini, and also the situation today as ilmani and non-ilmani. And then the 19th century Muslim thinkers such as Jamaluddin al-Afghani implicitly equated the 19th century positivists with the 7th century opponents of the Prophet Muhammad, and the scholarists with the atheists. So there is a sense of rejection among Muslims growing up from this opposition, this polarization between positivism and secularism on the one hand, and religiosism, let's say, or spirituality on the other hand. As a result, the polarization between Islam and the West deepened, and we always seek the main cause of problems afflicting Muslims today in Islam. So this is also responsible for the situation we are facing today. So to my opinion, it's actually authoritarianism in the Muslim world is more a product of their failure in responding to modernization and globalization. We can compare to some extent to the case of Indonesia. If we believe that the state alliance, state ulama alliance thesis is the most convincing one, actually the case of Indonesia is somehow provides some other perspective on that. During the New Order, the ulama was very close to the state, to the New Orders. Majlis Ulama in Indonesia was the main collaborator. They provided always the patronage to the regime. They give the legitimacy to policies taken by the regimes. But we also understand that Indonesia during the New Order was good in terms of economic standards. Economic situation prospered during the New Order. After the New Order, actually, the alliance between the ulama and the state somehow become very problematic. The ulama did no longer always support the state. Sometimes they also stand as a critical power in the society that criticize the state policies. But we understand that Indonesia, after the New Orders, had to struggle a lot to deal with the economic situation and so on and so forth. When achieving independence, actually native rulers failed to build a coherent political programs. They failed to build open debates, develop checks and balances and curtailing powers, and the flexibility to produce a stable political practice. This is exacerbated by overwhelming demographic and structural problems, including high fertility. We can see the level of fertility of women in the Muslim world is much higher than the level of fertility of women in other countries. It is also related to the anticipated growth of job seekers, urbanization, the public services, lack of job opportunities, low salary, and etc. Why regime in power in Muslim country could not develop economic, for instance, could not provide good public services and so on and so forth, because they trap in the circle of corruption, and they also provide, like, you know, privilege to their colony in power. So amid these failures, actually, Islamism came to promise a perfect society and try to mobilize people on the basis of its perceived perfectness. And the slogan, Islam is the solution. They try to delegitimize the existing regime by emphasizing their neglect of Islam in favor of the West. They all simply here in this context highlighted the arguments developed by previous Muslims that Islam should be different from the West. You know, Islam is not the same with the West. Islam is something perfect. Islam believe in God, and so on and so forth. So the regime later on responded such a challenge either by applying indiscriminate suppression or applying Islamic Leviathan strategy, if we use Fali Nasser terms. They normally, the regime in power in the Muslim countries are not quite creative. They develop indiscriminate suppression. Otherwise, if they could take another alternative, they will move into Islamic Leviathan strategy. So the choice taken by a regime in Muslim countries only between these two alternatives. As a result, Muslim world has been in the circle of contention between protests, artificial accommodation, indiscriminate suppressions, violence, and terrorism. While applying the Islamic Leviathan strategy, the regime tried to strengthen their alliance with the ulama because they tried to make sure that there was no challenge from the opposition. So the ulama play an instrumental role in providing religious legitimacy for the regime. The increasingly significant role of the ulama, who in fact began to lose their legitimacy and relevance, if we refer to the thesis by Muhammad Qasim Zaman. So ulama today is quite problematic. They are facing multiple problems. On the one hand, they have to face with the losing of their legitimacy because of the expansion of the state. The state provided the society with new reference in their life. So the ulama, which were previously serving as the most important reference for Muslims in their life, now lost their legitimacy and also lost at the same time their relevance. So to maintain their relevance and their legitimacy, ulama had no many options but to collaborate with the state, with the ruling elite. So this is a kind of problematic thing facing the ulama. They do not want to lose their legitimacy and the relevance, and the option is to support the elite in power. So the significant role of ulama in the state power facilitated the expansion of religious symbols to control all social and political arena. I remember the thesis by Stefan Lacroix in the Islamic Awakening. He analyzed about the radicalism and terrorism in Saudi Arabia. And one of the questions is why radicalism and terrorism develop in Saudi Arabia. He argued that this is not because of the Wahhabism, but rather because of the inappropriate response by the elite in power when they face such a challenge from the Islamists. Actually, they should develop appropriate response to the challenge of Islamism, the Ash-Shahwa movement in this context. But rather than responding the challenge of Islamism by developing, let's say, economic and so on and support, providing justice for the people, but invited the ulama to be closer with them. And when the ulama become part of the state powers, it is very difficult for the regime in power to control social and political arena. All social and political arena become embedded with the religious symbol. So this situation provided the foundation for the expansion of radicalism and terrorism, according to Stefan Lacroix in his book. So consequently, actually, conservatism and radicalism thrive well to the extent that violence and terrorism become the norm in everyday life in that situation. So this is somehow strengthened the thesis developed by Professor Kuru. The last slide here, I want to think something different, probably somehow kind of solution that we might take in understanding the relationship between Islam and democracy. I think juxtaposing Islam with the West is no longer quite relevant, as we believe that nothing intrinsic to Islam makes it vulnerable to violence, authoritarianism, and underdevelopment. And democracy should not be identified as a kind of religious faith. It is only a mundane modern system that makes possible the peaceful and rational management of public affairs. So if we emphasize democracy, a kind of religious faith, and then the answer from the opponents of democracy will be also try to emphasize the importance of religion as an alternative for democracy. So this provide the legitimacy for the Islamists. We are supposed not to seek the legitimacy for the democracy in Islamic teachings, nor certain historical model of Muslims in the past. Democracy, I believe, actually could develop well if the situation, the circumstance, economic circumstance, political circumstance support the democracy to develop. The team of researchers led by Brian Turners a couple of years ago conducted research to see the foundation that makes multiculturalism develop well. And they refer to the 16 conditions. One of the conditions is the sustainable economic growth. There is a condition that to see multiculturalism develop, a country should have at least GDI $6,000 US. Muslim countries, including Indonesia, has less than $6,000 US. Indonesia has only like 3,600 or anyway less than 4,000 US. So we need to encourage Muslim countries to develop economic growth. And also another condition, for instance, Muslim countries should develop appropriate social security net. Without appropriate social security net, many people become frustrated with the situation. They can live properly, they can enjoy their life. So as an alternative for their failures to enjoy life, as the frustration they are experiencing in their life, they go to Islamism. They will take the idea offered by the Islamists, and this become, you know, this provide the situation become the situation that make Islamism develop well. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Professor Nurhaidi, for your notes. And I think a lot of things to think. Probably later on, Professor Kuru can give some comment and also some explanation on Professor Haidi's note. There are a few things that we can discuss on the relation between democracy and economic growth, and should we go back to the question of Islam and itself, or the social context and political situation. So thank you very much, Professor Nurhaidi Hasan, for your notes and comment. Now, I would like to invite Mas Burhanuddin Muhtadi. But before that, I would like to introduce him. Burhanuddin Muhtadi received PhD in political science from the Australian National University. Currently, he is a lecturer at Syarif Hidayatullah State Islamic University, Jakarta, and also an executive director of Indicator, a prominent pollster and political consultant in Indonesia. In 2019, Burhan received Indonesian Platinum and Best Corporate Award as the most trusted survey institution company of the year. Burhan's excellent research and politics has made Southeast Asia Research Group awarded him the Young Southeast Asia Fellow Award in 2018. Burhan is the author of Food Buying in Indonesia, The Mechanics of Food Buying in Indonesia, published by Palgrave Macmillan 2019. Burhan's article appears in various journals, including Pacific Affairs, Contemporary Southeast Asia, a Journal of International Strategic Affairs, Electoral Studies, and many more. Burhan's recent article is Selective Belief, How Partisanship Drives Belief in Fake News, co-author with Tabares and Niazi in International Journal of Communication Forthcoming. And last, Burhan is also the example of independent scholars and also a successful businessman. So time is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Jamhari Ma'ruf, for your kind introduction. First of all, I would like to extend my deepest thanks to Rector Professor Komarudin Hidayat, Mas Jamhari from Universitas Islam International Indonesia for the opportunity to speak on this seminar discussing an excellent and must-read book written by distinguished scholar Professor Ahmad Kuru. And after enjoying Professor Ahmad Kuru presentation, hope the participant can understand his important finding when explaining the causes of Muslim world decline. And my job here is to examine his theory in the context of Indonesian Muslim societies. So let me begin with this overview. So as you already noticed, that basically the book describes authoritarianism in Muslim societies and the state of underdevelopment. And much of the Muslim countries authoritarian, 9 of the 15 most repressive regimes in the world in recent years are found in Muslim state. And at the same time, most of the Islamic world is left behind in terms of socio-economic development, as already discussed by Ahmad Kuru. And some of them are in fact among the poorest in the world. No Muslim country is included among the advanced country. And the question that the author raises is, why do Muslim majority countries exhibit high level of authoritarianism and low level of socio-economic development in comparison to world averages? So the recent question is quite similar with, as Professor Ahmad Kuru acknowledged, with Shakib Arslan Limada. So let me start it with his main argument. Yeah, this one. So basically, Professor Ahmad Kuru and Professor Nur Haidi Hassan has already mentioned in their presentation, but I just want to repeat once more. So using his historical comparison, Professor Ahmad Kuru criticized two dominant streams in explaining the causes of Muslim world decline. Actually, 3 dominant streams, but I just want to highlight 2 of them. The first school, Islam is the main cause of disparity. Kuru refuted notion, arguing that Islam is not responsible for such underdevelopment because Muslims were philosophically and economically more developed than Western Europe between the 9th and 12th centuries. And the second argument that the author opposed is about Western colonialism factor. Professor Kuru rejects this argument, suggesting that the Islamic world had already experienced a sharp decline in politics, economics, and intellectualism when colonialism began. So just want to continue. Professor Kuru argued that in the early history, Islam demonstrated cultural, economic, political, and intellectual dominance characterized by a large number of influential thinkers and merchants when religious orthodoxy and military rule were prevalent in Europe. However, according to Professor Kuru, in each later development, an alliance between Orthodox Sunni clerics and the military state began to emerge. And this alliance, he continues, slowly but surely inhibits intellectual economic creativity by marginalizing the intellectual and bourgeoisie classes in the Muslim world. So in short, basically, this book argues that the golden age of Islam was the result of the alliance of independent scholars and merchants, whereas the decline occurred when the alliance shifted to an alliance between the Orthodox state ulama and the military rule. So that's the thesis that I would like to examine in this presentation. So my argument is that the alliance between the Orthodox state ulama and military rule, which is considered to be the cause of Islamic decline, could dominate the Muslim world for a long period of time because the coalition has enjoyed continuous public support among Muslim communities. That's my hypothesis. And I would like to test that by examining the level of public support for the Orthodox cleric and military, especially in Indonesian context. So I base my finding from surveys conducted by Indonesian Political Indicator and Indonesian Survey Institute from 2016 to 2020. And in the next analytical step, in order to closely investigate the relationship between support for military and Orthodox ulama, I analyzed a recent survey that was commissioned by Puslitbang of Ministry of Religion and conducted by my polling institute in September 2020. Just for your information, Indicator and LSI stick to the standard methodology of surveying all Indonesians over the age of 17, and multi-stage random sampling was used to produce a sample that enabled me to make an inference and generalization about the national population. For purposes of this study, despite, of course, the survey including citizens of all religions in the data, the analysis focused on Muslim respondents only. So, of course, I just ran the data since Shafiq Hasim asked me to speak on this webinar. So this is preliminary study in assessing how many Muslims in Indonesia actually support the military government and the Orthodox ulama as the variable of interest of this presentation. So the purpose of this study is to identify factors that predict support for the military rule and Orthodox ulama, and the second is to assess the relationship between the two with support for authoritarian attitudes, intolerance, and Sharia law. And to measure this concept, of course, I developed indexes based on responses from several survey questions that capture different facets of relevant concept. But I have to acknowledge that all indexes were established ex post facto from the survey data rather than at the time that the survey was being designed. As I already mentioned, I just ran the data around 2 weeks ago while the survey was conducted last year. But the questions included in each question were chosen based on how well they match up to lay and scholarly understanding of each theoretically and or practically relevant concept. So this is the outcome of the interest. We have 3 dependent variables. First is support for the military government measured by the data that are available, the level of agreement with the statement, active military officers should lead our government, whether the respondent agree or disagree, whether they don't have an opinion. And the second one We also asked whether Indonesian Muslim agree with the statement true Muslims should listen to and obey the word of religious leaders without reserve. Sami'na wa ta'na. And lastly, I established an index combining answer to the above two questions that gauge survey respondent support for ulama and military rule. And this is the independent variable that I used to measure, to predict support for ulama and military rule. So this slide designed independent variable needed to examine those factors predicting support for ulama and military. First of all, of course, I included demographic variable, potential relevant factors such as age, education level, income, ethnicity, region, urban, rural status. And of course, you can also look at the measure that I use in this table. And I also put other concepts that may predict support for the ulama and military rule, such as political affiliation, religious piety, grievances, support for Sharia law, support for democracy, and illiberalism. I don't want to spend a lot of time for discussing this. So let's start with the descriptive finding. As you can see, 40.9% of Indonesian Muslims show strong support for active military officer, not yet retired, to lead the government. So while the response quite centered, but the model answer is this. And this is the trend. As you look at this trend, the trend for supporting the military to be active in the government is rising. It was just only 34% in 2016, 32% 2019. But if you look at the trend, the graph shows a similar pattern. The support for the military among Indonesian Muslims is slightly higher than general population. So just a very brief explanation about the breakdown. So when we disaggregate based on demographic variable, the findings show the clear education level divide. 48% of Muslims with lower education strongly agree or quite agree with the statement the active military should govern, while the figure is only 36 or 35 among medium and higher educated Muslims. Similarly, non-Javanese and people living in outer island are more likely to support the notion that active military officers should run the government. This also about the breakdown. And if you look at the table, there is an indication that professional and those who voted for Islamic parties tend to support the military. But of course, we need to test this to examine whether the relationship is spurious or not by using multivariate analysis, as I will be explaining later. And next, this is the second component, what Professor Kuru said as a contributing factor for the Islamic decline is support for the Orthodox ulama. Frankly, I don't have a specific question on this, but I employed this question to measure support for religious leaders. So the question that I use is whether respondents agree or disagree true Muslims should listen to and obey the word of religious leaders without reservation. And as you can see, a significant proportion of Muslims agree that true Muslims should listen to and obey the word of religious leader without questioning. And again, this is just give you some overview about the breakdown. As you can see from this table, there is a clear divide in terms of age, ethnicity, rural, urban status, region, education, income, and job. Younger Muslim, non-Javanese, rural people from outer island, less educated, low income, fishermen, farmers, and those with lower income tend to support the ulama. So note that, Professor Kuru, as already explained in his book, first reviewed established theories about the decline of Islam and then advanced his own thesis suggesting that it was an alliance between Orthodox state ulama and military state that led to the decline. So it is very important for us to test whether the two variables basically have a positive correlation. So to do that, we need to establish an index combining answer to the two questions that gauge survey respondent support for ulama and military rule. So before I establish an index, I use confirmatory factor analysis, and as you can see from this table, two items that make up the support for the ulama and military index constitute a single factor. And my findings so far have provided empirical evidence for Ahmad Kuru in the context of Indonesian Muslim. And you can see from the bivariate test, for example, the relationship between support for ulama and military is substantial and statistically very significant at 99% level. This is just beginning, basically. And for that, I established an index. It's simple to read this graph. The higher the score, the more support for ulama and military alliance. So at least 41% based on the classification scheme that I made, Muslim expressed very positive feeling for the ulama and military rule. And now it's time to discuss about the result of determinant of support for the military. This is the first dependent variable. So it's basically easy to read. Yeah. So I just want to help you how to understand this graph. So the figure plot point estimate coefficient and 95% confidence interval for each predictor or independent variable, where the axis is scaled in standard deviation. So for example, when the point is to the right of the zero is very important in this, yeah, there is estimate positive relationship. But if the point like rural education to the left of zero, it means there is a negative relationship. And if the confidence interval doesn't cross zero, for example, like education and then Japanese, the interval doesn't cross the zero, there is a significant relationship. So just disregard those variables, which cross the zero, because basically not statistically significant. So based on this, support for the military is explained by just only two variables. First is about education. So education has statistically significant and negative relationship with support for military. So the lower the level of education of Muslim, the higher the support for active soldier leading the government. The opposite is also true. The second, ethnicity matters in explaining support for the military rule. Non-Japanese Muslim are more likely to support army than Japanese. Next, this is a regression analysis of the determinant support for the ulama. And as you can see, again, education and then ethnicity matters in explaining support for the ulama. But we have one more significant relationship, namely Islamist grievances. As I already presented earlier, Islamist grievances will measure whether Indonesian Muslims feel aggrieved about the collective problem attributed to the Muslim community. So lastly, this is the last regression that I would like to present based on the index of support for ulama and military. And you can see from this regression table, we have basically three consistent variables that really significant to explain support for ulama and military. The first is education. Yeah, so education level appears to be the most important demographic predictor of support, with less education generally associated with greater support. And of course, it's not surprising, because less educated has little understanding about the democratic values that active soldiers should not rule, and they also tend to follow the opinion of ulama without criticism. Second ethnic group, non-Javanese, again, appears to be the most consistent demographic predictor, along with education. Of course, it is interesting, but additional research will be required to answer why non-Javanese more likely to show greater support for ulama and military. And lastly, Islamic grievances generally associated with greater support for ulama and military. So the last two slides, this is very important because if we read Professor Kuru's book, the author undertake to describe the current situation of Muslim countries relating to violence and authoritarianism. He explained the role of the religious scholar in the development of authoritarianism, intolerance of violence in Muslim societies, just read in part 1 of his book. And it is crucial to assess whether his theory is true in the context of Indonesian Muslim, whether there is a significant and positive relationship between support for ulama and military role with authoritarian attitudes, intolerance, and support for Sharia law. And as you can see, based on this correlation table, it is true. It is the case. It is particularly the case in Indonesia. So support for authoritarian was measured by an index combining answer to 5 questions that gauge survey respondent support for authoritarian attitudes, such as punishing all group deemed divine and heretical by religious leaders, enforcing law, even by violating human rights and the like. And when I use bivariate statistic to test support for ulama and military, as you can see from this correlation, the relationship between the two very substantive and significant. So this is consistent with prior expectation from Professor Kuru. And second, social intolerance. In this case, tolerance. If point to negative relationship, it means intolerance. So the tolerance were measured by an index again, combining answer to 4 questions, whether Indonesian Muslim mind if non-Muslim hold religious services or building houses of worship nearby, or whether they mind if non-Muslim become their neighbors. So it's social intolerance. And as you can see from the correlation, I did find the data that those who supported the Orthodox ulama and military state tend to behave intolerantly toward non-Muslim, shutting themselves off from openness and progress. Meanwhile, there is no consistent relationship between support for Sharia and ulama military index. So lastly, this is my conclusion. First, the ulama and military alliance which was alleged to be the cause of Islamic decline was possible, this is my argument, because of the greater support of Muslims. Yet, this alliance has in fact had a negative impact on the intellectual and economic progress of Islamic world. This is particularly the case in Indonesia, where significant proportion of Indonesian Muslims show a greater support for Orthodox ulama and military rule. Education, ethnicity, Islamist grievances are consistently predictive of support for the ulama and active military running the government, with less educated non-Javanese and religious political grievances associated with the greater support for the religious leaders and military alliance. In line with Professor Kuru's thesis, my study found that strong support for Orthodox clerics and military rule has significant correlation with agreement on authoritarian attitudes and intolerance behavior. Last but not least, for my fellow Indonesian, given that Professor Kuru's brilliant book has been translated and published in Bahasa. I would recommend you all to buy the book. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam. Thank you very much, Mas Burhan, for interesting findings. I think Professor Kuru, no wonder that your book has found a home in Indonesia, because people read it and very interesting to continue. And probably it will be a future project to test your book in strategic and political things like what Burhan did in other Muslim world. So thank you very much, Burhan, for providing us a very interesting study on the relationship, on the alliance of Orthodox ulama and military in Indonesia. Before I read some questions to you, Professor Kuru, do you have something to say to respond to Professor Nurhaidi and Burhan's presentation, please?
Very briefly, I am thankful to both of them, and teşekkür in Turkish, shukran, and thankfulness. So I have notes, and very briefly I want to say that Dr. Muhtadi's presentation is very informative. I learned many things, and I'm looking forward to see it as in a published way, as an article that I'm looking forward to cite it, to teach it, and to refer to my friends to read. And in fact, he was the first one, probably about 1.5 years ago, in Twitter, present my book and say this should be translated into Indonesian. I'm also thankful for that. So it's very interesting for me to learn the support based on certain level of education, ethnicity, and Islamic grievances, how Muslim Indonesians to a certain extent support ulama state, and especially the connection between these two is very informative, and I learn a lot, and thank you very much. And for Dr. Hassan's, it was also very informative, and it was impressive, because you brought many literature and very broad perspective on the literature on religion and politics in general, Islam and democracy in particular, and very informative, very well organized. Thank you very much. I only have 4 things to say out of my notes, very briefly. About Muawiyah, we are on the same page. I agree with you, because he lived in the 7th century, which is not part of my golden era. Basically, the golden age I refer to 8th to 12th century as 5 centuries in a broad way. More specifically, 9 to 11 in terms of economic development and philosophy, and Muawiyah as a 7th century dictator or a sultan is not part of it. And even if he had lived in the 8th, 9th, 10th century, he was a ruler. Muslims had many rulers in the Abbasi, etc., which some of them contributed, some of them did not. But the unintended consequence of Muawiyah, that he didn't intend, but unintended consequence, was that because of his persecution, Muslim scholars for centuries became disenchanted, and they saw that politics can be corrupt and they should put a distance. About the continuing dynamism, I also agree with you to a certain extent. Let me tell you that after 11th century, dynamism continued in a declining degree. Ibn Khaldun in Muqaddimah said that the last Muslim important philosopher is Tusi, and the last Islamic scholar is Taftazani. You are right that in Andalus, in the 15th century, Shatibi brought the important idea of Maqasid al-Sharia. But if you put Shatibi in the West and Taftazani and Jurjani in the East, unfortunately, these are the last major names. At least in the context I know well, Ottoman Empire and Turkey and Safavids, Jurjani and Taftazani, this 14th century Islamic scholar, kept teaching in madrasas. And unfortunately, we don't have major names after them. So dynamism continued in a declining manner. And in my book, the last attempt to revive science was the Ottoman Istanbul Observatory of 1570 That's the, in fact, background of Dr. Muhtadi's paper's picture. It's from Istanbul Observatory. And I would argue that that's the only picture you can find people with turban looking with some astronomical tools, because after the destruction of the observatory by a fatwa from the Sheikhul Islam of the Ottoman Empire, ulamas issue a fatwa that this should be destroyed. And then the Ottoman Navy bombed from Bosphorus the observatory. The Sultan was expecting astrological things, that prophecy in the future. The Sultan was disappointed. He was not a scientific-minded Sultan. The Sheikh al-Islam issued the fatwa. The Navy, so you see ulama military, they destroyed the Ottoman observatory 1570, and no more science after that until the mid-19th century. So yes, the 19th century was important, but the reason why I emphasize 11th century is that even today, Ghazali and Mawardi are regarded as two main philosophers of Islam in terms of political interpretation. The only third person you can add to Ghazali and Mawardi is Ibn Taymiyyah. I have many contact with Islamists in Turkey. I conducted interviews with Muslim brothers in Egypt and Nahda in Tunisia. And these three are very influential. In the 19th century, yes, we had Muhammad Abduh. But when Abduh was attacked as being a non-Muslim, they say he is too much reformist. Abduh is not a good Muslim. A student of Muhammad Abduh in Egypt defended him, saying that, no, my teacher died in the religion of Ghazali. So Ghazali, for many Muslims, is the reference after Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. Ghazali is the second man. 11th century and legacy, therefore, is very important. And the last thing I want to emphasize is that when I compare the 8th to 12th century and then the later period, especially after 15th centuries, look at the paper and printing press. When Muslims saw paper making of Chinese in the 8th century, immediately pick up, establish many factories from Baghdad to Cordoba, and Europe waited 5 centuries to learn the technique. Europeans were very slow to produce paper. But when it comes to 15th century, Muslims saw the printing press, but they were indifferent, they were lazy, they were not interested for 3 centuries. So that was a major difference. I imagine Ibn Sina, Biruni, and Ibn Haytham, if they lived in the 15th century, they would immediately pick up the printing press. They had not been different. Even in Islamic sciences, look, the first interlinear translation of the Quran Karim happened in the 10th and 11th centuries in Turkish and Iranian, Persian. So Muslims, early Muslims, were very open-minded. You know, Abu Hanifa issued a fatwa that the Quran in translation can be recited in daily prayers. So Abu Hanifa was very open-minded. And in the 10th, 11th, 12th century, Muslims translated the Quran Karim to Persian and Turkish interlinear version. But later on, ulama became so close-minded that they blocked the printing press in the Ottoman Empire from 1450 to around 1750 for 3 centuries. When they issue a fatwa that printing press is permissible, they put a note that only non-religious books. From 1727 in Ottoman Empire to 1800, only history books, dictionaries, etc. From 1800 to 1840 or so, only tafsir, exegesis, and some textbooks in madrasas. The Quran was not permitted to be printed. Then they issue a fatwa that Quran Arabic can be printed around 1850, but they did not allow translation. And then Turks should have the Republic after the Ottoman Empire finally printing out a translation of the Quran, which showed to me that early Muslims were open-minded, not only in science, natural science, but also in Islamic sciences. And now these are my notes. Thank you very much. And then if there are questions from the audience, I'll be happy to answer. I'm very thankful to both of you. It's my pleasure and honor to listen to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Kuru. There are some questions. One of them is this. As the majority of Muslim world today is underdeveloped and ruled by authoritarian regimes or illiberal democrat regime at best, a section in the Muslim world has romanticized the Ottoman Empire and wanting to recreate such empire in the modern world. Can you please comment on this? And,
thank you.
Yeah.
And let me ask you, how many time do we have? How quickly should I respond? 5 minutes, 10, 15, 20?
5 minutes. I don't know what time.
For all questions, just 5 minutes, huh?
Yeah, right.
Okay, good. So very quickly, I know that the Ottoman Empire now is romanticized not only in Turkey, but also in Pakistan and other parts of the world with the TV series, Ertuğrul and others. I don't know whether in Indonesia you have them, but in the subcontinent, they are very famous. And when I gave an interview to Euronews Turkish and criticized the Ottoman Empire, the Turks very negatively reacted. They call me an Orientalist, an American brainwashed Turks, etc. But I'll try to explain them that the Ottoman Empire was a geopolitical genius. Geopolitically, it really tried to save the Muslim world. It tried to help Muslims in Spain, Andalus, when they were killed and excluded by Spanish Reconquista. The Ottomans sent artilleries and military elements to Morocco and defeated the Portuguese Empire in Morocco. The Ottomans tried to open the Suez Canal in order to send the navy from the Mediterranean to Red Sea to Indian Ocean to support the Portuguese, that's to stop the Portuguese. Then the Ottomans also tried to open a channel in the north to link the Caspian Sea to Black Sea in order to fight against the Russians. And you know that they sent a navy all the way to Java, and before Java, the navy reached to India, Somalia, etc. So this is the navy part, which is the weaker part. The stronger part of the Ottoman military was the army. So this is one thing that geopolitically, militarily, really impressive. And from a Muslim point of view, they try to stop the colonizers. And politically, in terms of having a meritocratic regime, on the conditions of their time, of course, they provide certain level of meritocracy. The most important prime minister of the Ottoman Empire was Sokollu Mehmet Pasha. He was from a Serbian family, ethnically Serbian, not Turk. And he was converted to Islam, but his own brother was the patriarch of Christian Orthodox Church. So it was an empire with, like today's America, different ethnic groups. Even in its decline, when it was collapsing, in 1877, the Ottoman Empire established a parliament, 60% Muslim, 40% Christian. So this is the first truly multi-religious assembly in the world. Even today, it's very difficult to see a 60% from majorities, 40% from minority religion. So these are the positive aspects, of course. But for me, the negative aspect was that with some exceptions, Muhammad Fatih, the conqueror, was an exception. He tried to support philosophy. And the Sokollu Mehmet Pasha, he supported the observatory I mentioned. These are exceptions. Fatih, the conqueror, was so open-minded that he invited Renaissance painters to Istanbul to make his own painting. But with this, if we put the exceptions aside, in terms of science and the economic mentality, the Ottomans had weak points. That's how the Europeans surpassed in science and economy and eventually even military. So that's why I don't have a romanticization of the Ottoman Empire, and we need to have more emphasis on science and economic entrepreneurs than Ottomans had.
Okay, thank you, Professor Kuru. And for Professor Nurhaidi and Burhan, you can have a comment on this question. To what extent does democratization potentially reduce the dominance of the ulama-state alliance in Indonesia?
Sorry, can you say again?
To what extent does democratization potentially reduce or improve the domination of the ulama-state alliance in Indonesia?
Yeah, Indonesian case is quite dynamic, I guess, in terms of the relation between the ulama and the state. Majlis Ulama Indonesia is not comparable to like Darul Ifta in Egypt or Hay'ah Kibarul Ulama in Saudi Arabia or Dinayat in Turkey. Majlis Ulama Indonesia, of course, represent the Orthodox Islam, and somehow, as a representative of a Muslim from different organizations, Nahdlatul Ulama joined the Majlis Ulama Indonesia, Muhammadiyah as well, and other Islamic organizations. And these organizations of Muslims in Indonesia, they develop a kind of, quite dynamic relationship with the state. On the certain situation, when they feel they need to support the state, they will support the state. But when they feel they need to criticize the state, they criticize the state. This is a kind of ideal relationship probably between the ulama and the state. Of course, there is always an attempt by the states to bring the ulama closer to their power, by providing legitimacy and support for their intellectual exercise and the support. But to my opinion, actually, we will see still a dynamic relationship between ulama and the state in Indonesia. And democratization in Indonesia, of course, support this dynamic. It is supportive to this dynamic, and probably also very important to underline that Indonesian government or the regime elite in power should provide the space for the ulama in Indonesia to still develop their independence. Despite the fact that they need some support from the ulama. So the independence of the ulama means that they can develop their critical standpoints, and critical evaluation for what happened in politics, for instance. So this will determine whether democracy in Indonesia continue to develop or otherwise will perish.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Nurhaidi. And Mas Burhan.
Basically, I have just very brief comment on that. So my impression is that democratization in Indonesia, especially since 1998, after the fall of Suharto, has increased the role of ulama, especially in the context of electoral politics. So ulama has a greater influence after 1998 because politicians basically very pragmatic. They are always looking for some people who have a greater influence to increase their electability, and one of them is, of course, ulama. So ulama in this case is not monolithic. Of course, we have ulama, for example, Kiai Mustafa Bisri, with very big knowledge on Islam, but it's not really popular among Indonesian Muslim. We have already tested that, but when we presented ulama like Abdul Somad, very popular, but he is not really, I think he is quite populist ulama, but his influence in electoral politics quite big, especially after 212 movement in 2016, 2017. The role of ulama, especially those who have conservative understanding of Islam, is becoming bigger and bigger. So it's, of course, alarming, especially those ulama who affiliate with NU and Muhammadiyah, because they, in the context of democratization, have to show themselves that they can attract, Indonesian Muslim, and this is, it's just like what is it, a battle, quote unquote, between ulama in the context of increasing their role within Indonesian democratization. That's it.
Thank you, Burhan. Ms. Iman already reminded me that we're already 2 hours in our discussion. But before closing, I will give Professor Kuru to say something.
Thank you. So I saw among the questions a very important one. Very briefly, I want to address, which is that if Islamic State is not the part of Islam, why did Prophet Muhammad ﷺ establish one? I want to say 3 things. 1, the Prophet did not establish an Islamic State. Therefore, he did not leave a political leader after him. Therefore, the Muslims had disagreements continues until today, because the Prophet did not have a political successor, because political system was not important for him. The message was important. Second, the Prophet ﷺ and the 4 caliphs had a charismatic authority. The Prophet was getting revelation from God. And then the 4 caliphs had direct personal connection with him. Therefore, it was an exception that can never be repeated again. No more prophet, no more revelation, no more direct personal contact. It's an exception not to be repeated. And the third thing is that he was not a state ruler as we understand state today. Yes, he led armies and he had a budget to a certain extent. But in Islamic history, the first person who used a crown, a throne, and other symbols of statehood was Muawiyah, that Professor Hassan and I keep referring him today. He was the real state builder, and the first state established by him. Until that time, it was loosely connected political authority and no bodyguard, no political symbols as we understand state today. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I have to close this discussion, although very interesting. Once again, thank you, Professor Kuru, for joining us this international webinar, and also Professor Nur Hadi Hassan for your insight, and also Professor Burhan for your interesting comment and also finding with your political statistic. And once again, we cannot wait, Professor Kuru, for your visit to Indonesia and then teaching in our university. I think your present will make a better and also different of our university. So
inshallah, thank you so much. You're very kind.
By this, I would like to close our discussion and back to Ms. Iman Sari.
Okay, great, Professor Jamhari. Thank you for having chaired this webinar. Also, our gratitude goes to all the speakers. Thanks for all participants. We appreciate very much for joining us. See you next time. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.
Warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you. See you, Mas Jamhari, Prof. Ahmad Kuru, Mas Nur Hadi.
Thank you.
Terima kasih Mas Burhan.
Yuk, sama-sama yuk. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam. Thank you.
Oke, makasih Mbak Iman Sari. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome, Professor.
Looking forward to
See you
seeing you in Indonesia, in Jakarta.
Thank you. Inshallah. Inshallah. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Professor Kuru, yeah. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Ma'assalam. Bye-bye.
Assalamualaikum.
Waalaikumsalam.
Terima kasih Mas Jamhari.
Ya, makasih Nur. Ya.